This is the Insider's Guide to Real Estate. I'm your host, Victor Normand, and today we go inside the tiny house. My guest is an artist, a singer, a songwriter, an author, and a builder of a tiny house. Please join me in welcoming Miranda Ashleen to the show. Miranda, thanks for coming.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, before we get into your experience as a tiny house builder, let's talk about what is a tiny house. Folks may not know. I know one when I see one, but give us a little more detail on what makes a house a tiny house.
So they are quite literally very small houses, and depending on who you ask, the actual size varies. Personally, I usually define tiny houses as something between 120 and 350 square feet. In the current concept of them, they're almost exclusively built on trailers because most towns have minimum size requirements that mean to build a house that small or that tiny is actually smaller than allowed on a legal foundation. Mm-hmm. So we build them on trailers, which is what people get used to seeing,
Sure.
and then either park them long-term or pull them around the country.
Right, so it's a house in every respect except that it's small, and the average size house, a new house around here is about 24 or 2,600 square feet, to put things in perspective. So tiny is an appropriate way to refer to these homes. So now tell us about your journey. What brought you to becoming a tiny house builder?
So I first heard about tiny houses in November of 2013. I was just on the internet and I found an article about a couple out in Portland, Oregon, and they had done the math and realized that in the 10 years they'd been living in Portland, they had spent $60,000 on rent that they would never see again. At that time, I had been living in Boston for 2.5 or 3 years already. I was living in very affordable graduate school housing, but even so, I had managed to spend nearly $15,000 on rent. And I'd never thought about doing that math before, right? And figuring out how much of this money, because you just write the check each month,
right,
and you don't think about it. So I actually sat down and I realized I could build half of a tiny house with the money that I've spent so far. And then I would just have a place to live rather than putting on all that money and never seeing it again.
Okay, so your focus was on the house itself, mm-hmm, and where it goes and all, where you put it actually, you work that out later. Mm-hmm. So what goes into a tiny house? Where do you start?
So you have to start by figuring out the plan or the design for the house. Some people are skilled in that regard and can design it themselves. Although I'm an artist and I felt like I could visually do it, I don't have the architectural or engineering background to be able to design what I believe would be a safe structure. So my first step was to find a company, and there are several, that make tiny house plans, just like a regular house plans. And I ended up going with the Tumbleweed Tiny House Company because they've been around for about 16 years, and they've put hundreds and hundreds of hours into making the safest, strongest plans that they can.
Mm-hmm. So you start off with a trailer base. That mm-hmm becomes the footprint for the house?
Yeah, so instead of laying a foundation, you buy a trailer and then
okay,
pull it up to wherever your build site is.
So did you design your house, or did you work from a set of plans?
I worked from a set of plans. I did design, so one of the things about Tumbleweed is that I think the most important thing is to get the structure, right, the envelope of the house.
Sure.
That's what I was nervous about.
Right.
But the interior I've definitely had more of a hand with.
So on the outside, there's one very important dimension on the outside, and that's the height.
Yes.
And you never need to be more than 14 feet. And why is that?
13'6".
Okay.
And that's the interstate regulations for the highway.
Okay.
And it's because since the house is built on a trailer, it has to be built to the highway specifications. Okay. It also can't be more than 8'6" wide. Okay.
Again, to be able to drive it on a highway.
Right.
Okay. So now the outside shell is set, but then the inside was you have to lay out the inside in
mm-hmm
terms of the functionality of it, but then you have a theme, I understand, for the inside of your tiny house. Tell
Absolutely.
us about that.
So the project is called Big Art Tiny House, and like you said, I'm building it on the front lawn of an art center, the Umbrella in Concord. And for me, the purpose is to highlight functional forms of art that are often overlooked by traditional venues. So the house itself is a piece of art, handmade in front of the public on the front lawn. But in addition to that, as an extra layer, everything inside the house, from the door to the beautiful stained glass window in the front door to the hand-thrown sink in the back to the curtain for the window, is handmade by local artists.
Okay, so, but the house has to function. So how do you deal with things like the utilities in the house? And I understand the biggest challenge is often plumbing for those houses. Tell us about that.
So the plumbing in this house, which is a pretty regular answer for tiny houses, is going to be a gray water system. That means there's fresh water coming in and being stored in a tank. In my case, I think it's a 35-gallon water tank. And that'll get hosed in from wherever you're parked next to, whether it's an RV camp or another person's home. That feeds the sink and the shower, and then you have a gray water tank, which takes the dirty water. Now, gray water is different than what we usually use in plumbing, black water, because it has no sewage in it. It's just, dirt and soap from washing your hands or washing yourself. And the reason you can be set up that way is that for the plumbing in the bathroom, we have composting toilets, which I realize is a big step for a lot of people, but it's one of the things that the more I learn about, the more of a sustainable and also economically sound answer it is to plumbing, both in small spaces and actually in larger ones.
So you've lived in a modest apartment, but the tiny house is modest to the extreme. How does it work? How do you have to continually move things around to be able to live in a tiny house, or how does that work?
So the first step is to downsize, to get rid of a lot of stuff. And I'm lucky. People build tiny houses at all different stages. There are people who are retiring, who are empty nesters who build houses, and they obviously have a lifetime of stuff to deal with. I'm in my 20s and I have a lot less stuff than somebody who's 60 years old. I'm looking at building at a tiny house. So for me, it's less about getting rid of stuff and more about being conscious about not buying things I don't need. So I'm trying to make sure that what's in the house is only stuff that I use regularly. But apart from that, it is true that we have all of these fun folding gadgets. So I have this beautiful table that was actually donated by one of the founding board members of the Umbrella. He lived right around the street. And he saw me building and he said, "Oh, I have this table. It's like a Murphy table." So the table folds into the wall and there are these two beautiful French doors that close in front of it. And when they fold out, benches come down and then the table comes down. And it's seating for 4 that collapses into a 4-inch by 48-inch space.
Neat. So it's a challenge for tiny house builders to use space very creatively.
Absolutely.
And even, it's kind of self-regulating. You only have so much space, so that limits the things you can bring in, but we've just gotten used to some possessions. I mean, the first tiny house builder was probably Thoreau, and if you see pictures of what they imagine or what he describes as the interior, there aren't things like flat screens or laptops and a lot of microwaves. I don't know. There are lots of things that have really become essential, even though in the truest sense they're not. Has that been a problem for you, in terms of trying to fit all those things into your tiny house?
Not really. I mean, when I first moved to Boston, I lived in this grad school apartment and we didn't have a microwave. And so I learned that, it's actually healthier and not quite as quick, but not too much longer to heat something up on the stove.
Sure.
So it really makes you question what is essential.
Sure.
And what do you need? And that changes personally. Right, so I'm not a huge cook, so the kitchen in my tiny house will be quite small. But I have a friend out in Los Angeles who has like a 4-burner stove and a hood top, and because that's what is valuable in his life.
Yep, and we can understand. We'll show someone an apartment in an older house, and they'll walk into the kitchen and be very surprised that it doesn't have a dishwasher in it, for instance. So it's a big leap from not having a dishwasher to having to wash your dishes in a very small sink.
To only having 4 or 5 dishes.
Sure. And often I've seen interiors of tiny houses, the sleeping space is often a loft space. So have you come to terms with that, sleeping in a loft?
Yeah, I mean, so one of the things that actually made tiny houses feel possible for me is that I've always loved small spaces. I grew up in a larger home in Connecticut. And I remember looking at the houses of all of my friends who had, these mansion-sized houses, and they just felt very cold to me. I think you can tell when a room is lived in or not. And so I made a pact with myself when I was a little girl that I would always use every single room in the house where I lived. Of course, that's much easier when you have one room.
Sure.
And so having a sleeping space that is specifically made for the size of sleeping doesn't worry me too much. I did need to make sure that I could sit up straight. You know, I'm a fairly tall person, and,
Yeah.
and the concept of not being able to sit up in bed was difficult.
Okay.
But yeah.
So, because we didn't mention this, but you're not only are you a tiny house builder, you intend to live in your tiny house.
I do.
So as you were building this, do you have any doubts as you were putting this house together and actually inside this smaller space?
Oh, always. I mean, anytime you go into a huge project, you have doubts. I don't have doubts about whether I can live in it. I don't have many material possessions. I don't have, you know, I didn't have to get rid of too many clothes. I had to figure out books. Books was hard. But I started a book club recently, and I started going back to the library.
Really?
So I was like, there you go.
Yeah.
I mean, we have all of these systems in place to support us. Why do you need a huge backyard when you live next to Walden Pond? Why do you need a huge library when you have the beautiful Concord Public Library right next door?
Sure.
So I didn't have doubts about that. I had doubts about my ability to construct a house because I had never picked up a hammer before. I have doubts about the community acceptance of the house. But I'm an optimist. I
You're
think
looking
it'll
forward
work.
to actually moving into your tiny house.
I'm really looking
Now
forward to
you play the
it.
piano, so that's probably something that you'll
Oh,
have
yeah.
to give up.
Yeah, well, I
Well,
mean,
no,
I work
terms-
at an art center.
There you go.
We've got like 4 pianos. So it's all about, there's this concept that a good friend of mine who lives in Louisiana talks about. And he says it used to be that your house was just a house. It was where you went to sleep. And then everything else you did outside your house, right? You ate outside, you entertained yourself, you exercised, you worked, you did all of that outside your home in the community. And thus you were more deeply engaged with your community. But in the past 150 years, we've been taking our homes and we've brought the exercise inside, and now we need space for a big exercise bike. And we've brought the entertainment inside, and now we need a space for a big flat screen TV. And in doing so, we've turned our personal homes into these fortressed communities that we almost never leave, and it's added to the isolation.
So the tiny house forces you out, keeps your possessions down, and forces you out into the community. So
Right,
that-
and it
that's
actually
interesting.
builds those, and I know some people have concerns, they're like, oh, these people are building tiny houses and they're just gonna come in and roll out. But I actually think the fact that I'll be living in such a small space will make me more of an active participant in whatever community I end up in.
Interesting. So getting back to the kind of the physical nature, you have to heat and cool it, which shouldn't be too hard because it's very small.
Yeah.
But I saw one tiny house video where the tiny house they brought it up to a piece of land on a mountain side, and the tiny house builder and dweller said that she was surprised that it was really the wind that presented a problem, because it is a small structure and it's really affected by the wind, and could feel the wind inside the house, and it took her a while to get used to that, which is something right now someone who's buying a house it doesn't think that.
Right, you don't tell them about the wind qualities.
No, the wind is something you hear and that happens outside of your house, but
Right.
doesn't affect you while you're inside. Anything else that you can think of that might be the experience of a tiny house dweller that a regular, if you will, home dweller would not experience?
Well, I think it's very true that wind, rain, storms, any of that, you're a lot closer to nature. Although it is a house and it is structurally sound, it's stick built, it has great insulation. It is true that anywhere I stand inside my house, I can see out in 4 directions,
Okay.
right? You're never isolated
If
inside.
it's only 8 feet wide, you're never more than 4 feet from the outside.
Exactly,
Really what it comes down
exactly.
to.
So, and that's goes back to Thoreau, the concept of actually living that small connects you with nature even more.
Right. And Thoreau's building experience was not unlike what many tiny house builders go through. He was really focused on using recycled materials and doing things himself. Any other similarities between Thoreau's tiny house experience and yours or tiny house builders?
I think part of it is his desire to build it himself, and the concept of, or with the folks who helped him build it, and his concept of how much meaning it adds to know what went into what you're living in. And that for me ties to the big art concept, it ties to the business that I'm founding, that when we know the story behind what we're using, it gives it more meaning. And if we surround ourselves with objects that have more meaning, it gives our entire lives more meaning.
Right. So a tiny house, building a tiny house is an experience different from building a regular house, because you really need, sounds like you really need to be more thoughtful about everything.
Well, I think people who are building their own homes, they definitely go through the same process, but almost nobody does that. You know, we
Sure.
buy these finished houses, and so I think it means that I have thought about in depth every inch inside my house. I have thought about what's going to go there and what it's going to look like. And for me, because of the artistic level, I've thought about who has made that. You know, when I finally move into my home, if I do a 180, I will look at the stories of over 50 different people. Mm-hmm. And I think that's beautiful.
It's interesting. So the tiny house builders that I have observed all seem to have this financial motivation as part of it, but then also seem to have some kind of a extended interest in it, whether it's artistic or very ecologically conscious. They always seem to bring something more to the project than simply building a structure. It's very interesting. So now let's talk about, so through your conversation here, I'm sure you've managed to convince some folks that they really ought to try building a tiny house. What are some of the challenges they'll face? So you mentioned where to put it. So let's talk about that in general. I won't ask you where you're going to put yours, but what are the challenges people face when trying to locate and build a tiny house?
The challenges is that this is still a gray area. So there aren't codes specifically for tiny houses. There are codes that apply to building foundation-based structures, and those don't really apply to tiny houses at this point because they're not a foundation. And then there are codes that apply to RVs, which is mostly what tiny houses fall into. And so figuring out where to put it, it's a dance to figure it out. You have to do a lot of research. And I always say the base rule of tiny houses is to be nice to your neighbors.
That always helps.
Always helps. I think that's a good base rule outside of the tiny house movement as well, but I think it's particularly applicable when you're doing something a little bit ahead of the fold.
Right.
And so for me, finding a space isn't about evading taxes or trying to figure out how to build this structure with as little materials as possible. I want to follow all of the codes that I know exist. But, you know, one of the codes is that all of the outlets have to be a certain foot from each other or from the bathroom. And it's true that I have a lot of outlets close to the bathroom because everything's close to the bathroom in my house.
Yeah. So you've mentioned that there are some communities, in places around the country that are trying to deal with tiny houses, but most building codes and zoning don't directly address tiny houses. If you buy a legal building lot, you can build a small house on it. Some communities have restrictions in terms of the size, but as you say, even communities that do not have size restrictions have other building codes that have an impact on size. When you try to comply with the codes, you end up building a bigger and bigger structure. So in terms of zoning, there's a conflict that if you build it on a foundation, then it's a permanent structure and that triggers certain codes. If you build it on a chassis, an RV, there are some communities that limit where you can park an RV. And then most communities won't let you live in an RV unless it's in an RV park. So how do you think we need to move this conversation forward? I know there's a recent example out in Hadley, in the western part of the state. You want to tell us about that experience? It's someone very similar to you, I think, who built this tiny house.
Yeah, Sarah Hastings. So we've never met in person, but we've communicated a lot just while she goes through what she's going through and I'm going through my project out here. She built her own home and she was living on it, I believe, in a friend's backyard. Don't quote me on that. But she was living and somebody reported her and gave her a cease and desist order because she was living full-time in a temporary structure. And she went in front of the zoning board, to attempt to pass a bylaw that would make it legal to live full-time in a tiny house. And she did wonderful, wonderful work, which is, I think, incredibly important to this movement right now, which is that she started to get the conversation going. And a couple weeks ago, she got voted down. I think 300 people showed up, and 200 people voted against it, 100 people for. But she has what's the perfect attitude, which that's 100 people who now support it. And I think this is a growing movement. It challenges some fundamental assumptions about essential necessities and about space. We're absolutely trying to build safe structures and trying to, fit somewhere within the system. So I think what the tiny house movement needs to do, and what I see it doing, is figuring out how to work with the system that's already there. Because I have the utmost of respect for people on zoning boards and in city governments. They deal with an incredible amount of variety and variables and just amount of things coming before them. And so I think when tiny house people are trying to figure out how we can fit into the system, if you go up to them and say, I have this house, how can I live in it legally? They're going to look at you and say, you can't. But if you do the research and you figure out how to go with them and say, there is an elderly couple, their children live far away, they need a caretaker. I want to live in my own separate space, but on their land in order to be their caretaker. And you show that there are caretaker laws that allow for small cabins on a larger structure. And you say, all I need is this variance that allows this tiny house to be categorized as a caretaker cabin so that we can all live in this symbiotic, healthy relationship. I get to have affordable housing. They get to have someone take care of them, and they don't have to leave their house.
Sounds perfect. I think many things that have to do with changing zoning have a lot to do with the fear of the unknown. People really don't know what it is, and if they don't know what is being proposed, they assume the worst.
Absolutely.
And that's defeats many well-intentioned zoning ordinance. I know that I spoke to a real estate broker who was marketing a pad within a mobile home park, and I looked at this listing, and it was priced very reasonably, and it seemed like a perfect setting for a tiny house in a mobile home. In fact, the tiny house is actually bigger than most mobile homes in terms of square footage. And she said that the association really was not in favor of it, and her take on it was that it really hadn't been presented to them properly. That she thought that this would fit very well within the mobile home park. But again, I have to believe it's just people not knowing exactly what's being suggested and assuming the worst. So I agree, and Sarah does have a great attitude that she's moving forward, and unfortunately she did have to vacate her tiny house and move it along. I'm not sure where she ended up. So now let's move on. We've talked about the physical nature of it and so on, but we know in my business there's a great demand for smaller homes, not necessarily tiny homes, but certainly for first-time home buyers that can't afford a larger home and don't really want a larger home. They share your attitude. And also for older people, us baby boomers, who really need to start thinking about downsizing. So do you see a segue between the tiny house movement and building smaller houses?
Absolutely. I don't think everyone should live in a tiny house. I'm not, standing up here and condemning everybody who doesn't live in 150 square feet. I think the most important thing about this movement is that it's making people ask base questions. How much space do I need? How much does that cost? How can I live in a smaller space and still have everything I need, and perhaps not need to work 100 hours a week at this over-demanding job, right? So it's making people question, and this is what's so scary, the change that you mentioned that's so scary, it's making people question the path that is provided. I think there is this very clear path of going to school, getting a full-time job, getting married, getting the big house, but why? I'm not saying that's bad. I'm just saying that if you do it, know why you're doing it. And so for me, the tiny house movement is about establishing the right size living. I don't need you to live in 150 square feet, but I just want to know that the space that you live in is being used well, is being loved, is being, thought about environmentally and affordably. I don't expect to live in my tiny house the rest of my life. I hope to have a family, and I don't really want to raise babies in 150 square feet. I know people who do, and more power to them, but personally I would like to be able to close the door between myself and my children. Yeah. So my mother and I joke that she's actually been basically the project manager on this house with me, which has been incredible. And we joked throughout the process that we're building the house that will start off my life. And by living in this tiny house, I'll cut my cost of living in half, which means I can actually go down the entrepreneurial path that I want to go. But once I get that business established and start a family, my mother is going to move in and it's going to be her retirement home.
Very good, good plan. So even Thoreau didn't plan on living in his cabin forever. In fact, he lived in it for 2 years, 2 months, and 2 days, by his reckoning. And the book he wrote, Walden, is about living in his cabin for 1 year. So, and unfortunately, I think there are lots of people who share your view, but really don't have options out there. And the history of the size of housing in the States is really, every year they seem to be getting bigger and bigger, and at some point, I don't know exactly what will drive the change. It may be the tiny house movement and tiny house nation that will. I think there is a lot of conversation about it, and I think that's a very good thing. Now let's just talk briefly. You're a tiny house builder, but you also are an entrepreneur and hope to build a tiny house version of, in a way, a hotel.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so my business is called Mirandas Hearth, and the goal is to become the first community art hotel, where everything in the rooms, from the food to the furniture to the soap to the dishes, is completely handmade by local artists. And the point of that is to help break down the barriers between creators and consumers, between artists and audiences. I think it's so easy to put successful artists over there and look at them and say, oh, that's so nice, they make these things. Now let me go back to my boring, non-creative job. Mm-hmm. And if you'll notice, the concept of the community art hotel is the exact same concept as the tiny house, sure. Right, where everything inside is handmade.
Everything, and it's also, everything is very intentional.
Exactly.
Things just don't happen, or we just don't accept what is handed to us, but it's very intentional, that we're very conscious about our physical environment, and by extension, you know, the larger environment as well. Mm-hmm. So, tiny house, Miranda's Hearth, is that something that it's extending beyond your generation? Do you think it's beginning to attract attention from an older generation, or?
Absolutely. I actually think the older generations are part of the drive for it, because there are folks who are so saturated with things that they don't need to go out and buy stuff anymore. Your houses are full, the storage units are full, the basements are full. So instead, people are looking past materials and realizing that material items are not what's going to make you happy. You're not going to, one of my favorite quotes someone said to me talking about tiny houses is that you're not going to go to your grave with a U-Haul behind you.
There you go.
You know? Everything else gets left here. So what is it that you're going to take with you? Right. And I think that's beautiful experiences, meaningful connections with other human beings, deep thoughts. And those are the kinds of things that I hope to encourage at Miranda's Hearth, at the Community Art Hotel, and also the kinds of questions that I'm hoping to encourage with this project and with doing it so publicly.
Right. So there's another expression that when you have everything, you might value nothing. If you have nothing, you value everything. Mm-hmm. So, Miranda, I want to thank you for coming by. You've really introduced a philosophical element to the Insider's Guide, and we appreciate that. And thanks for coming.
Absolutely, and I hope you'll come back for the Tiny House Festival
We'll do
on
that.
July 16th.
Okay, and that's our show. Thanks for watching.